Unless anyone has anything pressing on the panel, I'd like to open up to the Q&A. So we'll take three questions. We have about 30 minutes, roughly, maybe just under. We'll take 3 questions. We only have 30 minutes, so as much as possible, please do keep your questions short or comments short, and the answers quite short as well, so that we can get as much discussion as possible. So we're going to go for gender balance. So ideally, I'd like to come to a lady first, if anyone has a question. Anyone? Lenny. So yeah, we'll take one from Lenny, one from Ben, and then I have one from online as well. So.
Haven't been called a lady for a while,
so
thank you for that, yeah. Craig. Lenny Wild from ODI. I mean, really rich set of discussions. I guess 2 quick reflections, and there are some questions. There's a question in there too. One is, I do feel like we need to just get rid of some of the myths that are out there. You know, that there has really been accountability for results thus far, because I think that's questionable, and that accountability in itself can be inherently incompatible with flexibility, judgment, adaptation. And I feel like those things still pop up. It seems to me that one of the problems we face across a whole realm of development practice is actually not enough accountability for results and impact, because those things are hard to do. We tend to default to accountability for inputs and outputs, a number of teachers trained and in schools, not the quality of education outcomes of children. And I think if we actually say we're going to get really serious about accountability for results, to me that then becomes very obvious that what you're in is a space that's about accountability for learning, for making the best decisions based on the best available evidence that you have, for the professional judgment you bring to bear on that, and for the ways in which you show that you are learning and changing your approach in response to the evidence that you get over time. So I think can we just try to kill off those myths and replace them with some of those realities? I think the other point that perhaps we haven't heard so much from those on the panel, would be good to perhaps reflect a bit more, is about the who. So who is it, when we're talking about empowerment, who do we want to empower at different levels? I think there is an interesting debate about how decentralized, for example, DFID is in practice now, and what some of the challenges about how you manage that decentralization while keeping the upwards accountability to ministers are. But I actually think the real prize out there is all the people that are actually delivering change on the ground, and what are the really good examples we have of the good models for empowerment and what works. I mean, I think there are copies in the foyer of a recent case study a colleague of mine, David Booth, has done, looking at DFID's, I think it's the Economic Policy Incubator project in Nepal, which actually essentially gets a bunch of very strong Nepali economists to think tactically, carefully, strategically about key blockages to economic change that they can start to unlock, and to build coalitions and think about sort of clever ways of starting to open up change. We documented something very similar in the Philippines that actually led to very big shifts in practice around land reform, around funds going into health expenditure for the poorest. So I think, can we talk a bit about what's working around good models of empowerment and for who would be great.
Thanks. Ben?
Thanks. Just a few reflections, really. And this whole point of every penny should be counted and should count. I think there's a slightly Orwellian point here, which is that not all pennies are equal. So specifically in relation to the non-DFID spend of ODA. So last year, non-DFID spend of ODA reached something like 26%. If you tally that up, that's $4.8 billion. That would make non-DFID spend the eighth largest OECD DAC donor, larger than every other donor apart from Canada. But when you look at how that money is actually accounted for and assessed, is it subject to the same level of scrutiny as the rest of the DFID spend? And it's possible to find some ICAI reviews that look at how other departments spend that ODA, but it's very hard to find independent evaluations. very hard to find results-based frameworks that talk about how the Home Office spend money or how the FCA spend money. In fact, informal conversations I had with an FCA official about whether or not they use log frames and results-based management went along the lines of, well, DFID are bureaucrats, we're diplomats, we think about change rather differently. But I think, so there's a point here that we are talking about the politics of results, but it is applied very unevenly across different organisations. What you can do with the politics of results, how you can play with that space, really depends on who you are, where you sit, what public trust there is in your role and in your institution, and how you then carry that. And I think before we can really talk about this seriously in a rational way in this kind of context, we need to be really transparent about that.
Okay, so we're going to come to our panel briefly. I want to add a question that's come in about from anonymous. So I don't know gender or who they are at all, actually, but they ask what is and should be the relationship between the media and development agencies. And I think it's quite a relevant question in the light of the results and value for money discussions as well. It's how development organisations talk about what they do. So we've got a range of questions here, right? We've got, are there too many myths in the discussion we've had so far today? Do we need to be talking more about accountability for learning? Who is actually being empowered, right? Who are we talking about? I'd argue probably Dan should take that one on. And then Ben, talking about the space, the politics of results and whether it's actually being applied fairly, accountability is being applied fairly across the board. Dan, can I come to you first on who's being empowered, and then we'll come to the panel on the rest?
Yeah, so there's both the question of who is being empowered and who ought be. And I guess the way I'd frame it is that constraint rolls downhill, but autonomy needn't. So that is to say, if the organization at level one, this to me is kind of the subtext of the conversation about the merger that we started with, that we started this conversation with. So if there's constraint at a high level, I need to constrain the next level down, and then that level needs to constrain the level below it. However, if I empower people at the level below, then those folks can decide when it's appropriate to engage in what kinds of management and accountability structures, right? And so, the question of who we should empower is the lowest level that we think is kind of globally responsible for the project or for the performance of the intervention, right? So, in the case of DFID, it seems to me we could think about the country office in just the way we currently do, but make part of that empowerment a greater discretion inside that office about how we manage those who are actually implementing the work, both in terms of form and in terms of day-to-day sort of management. And so, in that sense, to touch just very briefly on Lenny's question, the tension between accountability and flexibility, or the apparent, but I agree with Lenny, kind of fictional tension between accountability and flexibility is resolved differently for different kinds of tasks in different kinds of settings. When we're talking about educating kids, we shift from thinking about outputs to thinking about outcomes in just the way that Lenny's suggesting. When we're thinking about something that feels a little bit more like Pablo's French Revolution, we think about accountability in a very different kind of way. And the who is the people closest to the ground who we trust to make the decisions and who have a kind of holistic view of the performance of whatever the intervention is we're talking.
Thanks, Dan. I'm being a bit selective here, actually, but I'd like to come to Pablo on the media question, because I know that that's something you've thought and written about quite a lot. So, how do you see that relationship?
Well, okay, so I recently wrote something for Bond, so you can go to their website. I have a post on this precisely, but, maybe Ben's question is a good answer. Maybe we should be saying to the media that aid tends to be more transparently and accountably managed than funds in other public organizations in the state, including the welfare state. Why not say that? Maybe we should be, to go back to Lenny's story, maybe we should be talking more about the activists and reformers and the intellectuals on the ground who are trying to make their countries better, and use those stories to say, these are not starving children, these are not tsunami victims, which is, people understand humanitarianism, but people don't understand development. They don't understand that a room full of economists thinking tactically may change the politics of a country. and we haven't explained that properly, I think. UK is a I would say it's strange in that the media actually pays attention to aid. In other countries, it really doesn't happen that much. And that's the bane maybe of having an independent ministry, or maybe the bane of the 0.7% in a country that is not a northern country. Maybe the media should not be talking about foreign aid at all, because it's really not that important to people's lives. It doesn't rank highly in anybody's priorities in terms of the problems facing in their lives. But we can take a bit of ownership of the narrative. We can develop a counter-narrative in the media, and that begins by being more proactive and less reactive. Though we were joking before, maybe the single most important change in British aid will be the replacement of the Daily Mail editor come November, and that is something that we cannot control. So maybe we are slaves to the tabloids after all.
Optimistic take. Okay, so I think the ones we haven't touched on as much is on the other government departments point. Nalima, did you want to come in on that?
I can do if you need someone to, but I do have some thoughts on that. But
go for it.
So I mean, the IDC inquiry into ODA administration by other government departments just reported a few weeks ago, and I think they too shared your concerns around the accountability structures and transparency of the spending that was going on beyond DFID. And if DFID is one of the most tightly kind of monitored government agencies, I would say, in the UK, perhaps these are on the other end of that spectrum. And I think you alluded in your comments about DFID playing much more of a technical role, advising other government departments and helping them spend that money. So not only is there a question of what are they doing, but do they even have the capacity to do what they're doing? And I think there's a recognition that that capacity needs to be built, hence DFID's involvement. I'm interested in even how we got to this point in 2018. I mean, in 2015 we had the new UK aid strategy, aid in the national interest, which, as far as I understand, DFID had relatively minimal input into, was largely kind of written by the Treasury. In fact, where this target of the 30% of all ODA should be spent by other government departments. I think the intention is good. It is meant to try and increase the whole of government conversation and coordination, but against the backdrop of weak capacity, questions of accountability, I think that do need to be addressed. So I share some of your concerns, but I recognize that the IDC report will hopefully stimulate greater scrutiny and greater conversation around this issue, around accountability of the rest of the ODA piece.
Just a brief comment from you, Val, if you don't mind. I mean, you mentioned earlier, in fact, I think the word you used, some sort of technical assistance to other government departments, but kind of reflecting on Ben's point, I mean, and the question I asked you earlier, what is DFID's role in helping other government departments become more accountable for the aid that they spend?
So that's a multi-layered question. So what is DFID's role, and then the accountability? So frankly, the way public finance works, we are not accountable. DFID, each department is accountable for its own spend, right? And that is a fundamental principle of public financial management. And so, you know, the Treasury will argue very strongly that that is the case. So the accountability point, I think, is a difficult one. But also, we shouldn't get too distracted by that. I guess there's a lot DFID can do. We're working with a lot of the departments in terms of helping them with their systems, with their design processes, the smart rules, all that, the technical solutions. But I guess the point I want to make is DFID has been on this journey for 21 years, right? We've been thinking about this, evolving our systems, our processes for a long time. The big uplift in these funds of 2 years ago, 3 years ago, when the Prosperity Fund was signed. So they are much earlier in that maturity journey. I think the CSSF, the Conflict Fund, does good stuff. Like the idea behind a cross-government fund to help support some really difficult stuff in difficult places is a good one. It brings together departments. It potentially has a higher risk appetite than DFID as a freestanding department would have. So it can take more riskier judgments. So I think there's a lot of good. The Prosperity Fund similarly has good things. The International Climate Fund, which we never talk about, also does really good work, and they're all cross-government funds. So I think there's a lot of good there, and I worry that sometimes we underestimate how young they are, and we've got to help them get to the point where DFID is. But that doesn't mean just absorbing them into DFID or throwing them away or whatever, but just working with them to improve. And that's kind of It's not a direct answer because we're still working out what that means in practice, but that's our kind of ethos going into this.
Thanks, that's really helpful. So I saw one hand, Duncan's one question from the lady at the front, and I'll take one from over here as well.
Thanks. Duncan Green from Oxfam. I mean, lots of discussion of accountability, but in quite general, sort of swirly terms. And I've always thought, I'm just wondering who is actually pressuring for accountability? And who, among those people who are pressuring for accountability, is it Parliament? Is it ministers? Is it actually something we've got in our own heads, a sort of accountability demon that we have to try and placate? How many of those points of pressure are actually amenable to evidence for or against? You're not going to convince the Daily Mail to change its view on aid by giving better information about your aid programmes. I suspect that's true of a lot of the people who are demanding accountability. So I think this is a question for Val, I'm afraid. But where is it actually coming from, and who's actually listening to any of the information you produce?
Thank you. This lady here, please.
It's probably easier to pass it to me. Thank you. I'm Alison Denbo-Ruth. I'm the Technical Director at Options. I've worked in development for about 25 years, most of it overseas. And I agree with Pablo's point about aid should be catalytic. The most useful things I've seen aid for is when it funds risk, because poorer governments, they're struggling just to deliver basic services, and we can't expect them, or many of them, to fund risky things, even though that might result in transformation. So I think that's useful. But at this stage, what I'm seeing is that the culture within DFID in terms of SROs is, because the performance management is quite rigid, is they are very risk averse. So two things: can the design of programs be designed to take risk and hopefully affect greater change, but be ready to fail? And can performance management culture within DFID change to support risk? Thank you.
Thank you. We have one more question from the chap here.
Hi there.
Oh.
Hi there. I was just wondering, in your time in DFID, if there had ever been any conversations about perhaps having a fund which emphasised the judgment, if you will, side of aid spend as opposed to the payments by results side of the aid spend. So, for example, calling it an R&D fund or something where you have more slack on the reins, so to speak, which you measure perhaps on a 10 and 20-year basis. So we could actually compare what we've got now with what possible futures could exist, if that makes sense.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to sneak in one more, so probably one question each, if that's all right, and fairly short answers, so we can get a couple more comments in. Shrutis Patel, who's following online, asks, it seems that, and we've talked about this a lot, the basis of accountability and results measurement is trust. Trust keeps coming up. But then, what are some good practice guidelines? Do we actually have good examples we can share? We say, well, they've got that right. You mentioned CEDA before. Are there things that can be shared with our online audience as well that actually start to give some signals of how you do that? So that would be really helpful to know. So anyone got a particularly burning desire to take on one of those questions? If not, I can direct them at you. Anyone? It's risky if you let me do it. So go on then, Val. You want me to?
I'm in your hands, Craig.
Okay, fine. Val, who's pressing for accountability?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I guess at one level it's me. I am responsible for quite a lot of the systems and rules. Now, I think, and again, it comes down to SROs are accountable for a series of different things, and we conflate all of that. So, are they accountable? So, in the kind of 2015, 2010 era, when was the manifesto? 2015 era. People were very accountable for delivering their targets. So if you were going off track on your targets, you had to explain why. You had to then have a plan for getting them on track. So targets, that was a very strong accountability for targets, which is actually quite easy to do organisationally. We can collect the data, we can push it back out. As we kind of evolve beyond that, it gets a lot harder to answer that question, actually. On the policy side, I think, going back to a point Dan made, incentives become as important potentially as the accountability side. So what are you incentivizing people to do up front? In a way, the accountability comes after that, but the incentives that really matter, and I think we have to think a lot more about incentives and what are we asking our teams to focus on. Then it's different on the compliance side. If a team breaches its budgets, then I'm holding them to account very strongly on all of the compliance tasks. If they do not get their business case approved by a minister at the right level and they start spending against it, then they are very accountable for that to me and to, I am acting on behalf of, Matthew as the permanent secretary. So for that kind of stuff, the compliance is very hard and it's non-negotiable. So I hold them to account for that. So I think, it comes back to this distinction between accountability for compliance and accountability for policy. And I think it's much tougher on compliance than on policy.
Thanks, Val. So, Nalim, I'd like to turn to you. I mean, we had questions there around performance management and risk. So you have an answer ready for that one? Then you can, please go ahead. This is a response to Alison.
Yeah. The question on risk, the first half really, that can we design programs to take on risk? I think we can design programs, but I think you need a number of kind of pieces to be aligned in order to design them. The first, I think, is we have to be able to communicate risk. And in a context, in this country, that's very hard to do, given the media, the role of the media. So I think, but we have to be able to communicate that risk and that the risk of failure in particular, and really explain to the public that, if we have zero tolerance of risk, right? We want risk essentially in our programs. And I think we also need to encourage informed risk taking, by which I mean we judge on the basis of the judgments taken at the time at which they're taken, and have people's backs. And so creating internal cultures that can support that is very important. I think we have to also inspire people, by which I mean tackling wicked problems that development tries to tackle. We need to take risk. And lastly, I'm not a fan of corporate managerialism in the public sector, but I think we can look to the private sector effectively and look at how the private sector encourages incubation of ideas, innovation, and argue for more of that in the public sector. So, I mean, my solutions may not be as tangible, but I think there is a cultural, a communication strategy, and kind of this idea of informed risk-taking that needs to really filter down to the programmatic level.
I think thanks, Nima. It'd be good to hear from both Pablo and Dan very briefly. We're a bit short on time now. But where you've seen examples of programs that have some slack on the reins, as the gentleman over here put it, right? Like what does that actually look like in practice? Because both of you are advocating for essentially more slack on the reins.
Well, I work as an advisor on a flexible DFID program, and we struggled for 2 years to develop a theory of change and a concept and a portfolio approach and a flexible log frame. And it's been a lot of hard work, but I think it's been incredibly rewarding because it's enabled us to move quickly away from non-performing interventions and to take advantage of opportunities that arise and to plan for contingency. But that's what I would call a portfolio approach, right? So that in which the log firm has to be a bit agnostic about the specific activities and the specific timing. That level of reporting and accountability has to be taken down to the level of activities and the level of interventions where advisors are actually on the ground working with local partners. And what the program delivers on is a number of more general issues or problems that are tackled, like wicked problems, as you were saying, in a sense of a greater scope over time and a greater depth of impact over time. So we think a lot about attribution, and to the question that Lenny was asking about, what is accountability really like? You can have the best numbers in the world, but if you don't have a good attribution of your impact, those numbers are meaningless. So interesting programs, to my mind right now, focus on learning and on working with the current tools in M&E to integrate them across the program and to build something that is a tiny bit more flexible, but that requires a funding modality that is a tiny bit more flexible, that requires an SRO who is willing to go to battle for you, that requires a provider who's not too scared of making mistakes. So it's a bit of a mixture of factors, but I think it's totally doable. And to its credit, DFID is, to my knowledge, currently tendering innovative programs. So this is a trend, at least in governance, that I'm seeing within DFID.
Great, thanks. Dan, just briefly to you, I know that you have this huge data set that you use to make a lot of your arguments in the book. So I'd be interested to know what that, the key argument is that greater autonomy ultimately leads to greater effectiveness, right? But what else can your data set tell us about this? I mean, was there any correlation, for example, with longer term programs? Is there other things you can unpack or examples you can unpack which give us a bit more of a flavor of that?
Yeah, those are great questions about the big data. I think I kind of want to turn to the case studies, which also form part of the book, right? So in 4 pairs of case studies, I look at basically interventions attempting to accomplish similar things that use, to steal the expression here, dissimilar slack on the reins, right? Where the horses are given more or less room to kind of guide themselves. What does it look like to guide yourself? What are features of that? Well, one thing that comes up a lot is a kind of empowered lowest level. So things like empowered advisors who are reporting back on targets that they themselves have set. I also see examples of, frankly, what I would call gaming metrics to have more successful projects. So, we choose a metric that we think is going to be met anyway. There's a case, actually a different case, where an Office of Financial Management's target is reduction in child mortality in a post-conflict country. That number is going to go down anyway, whatever happens with regards to the project. So it gets to declare success anyway. And so it then can navigate in a variety of ways. In terms of what I think is the maybe most kind of, modelable example, of all places in a USAID project where we have an uncertain environment and not a lot of trust in the system and to a contractor, what USAID does is put project staff, put DFID staff, USAID staff, in the same office as the implementer, right? So we don't trust our implementer, fine. We're going to co-locate with our implementer, and now we're going to experience the same reality, right? We're going to be able to make the same judgments. Now when you come for approval for a revision, well, I will know the same things you do. And in a sense, we're going to guide this project together. And, to me, that's an example of how, without changing any of the political structures or organizational structures in kind of a broad sense, we can get more judgment and more effective Slack and more kind of local information into a project when need be.
Thanks, Dan. So we're so short on time. Thankfully, we do have drinks outside, and so you can come up and talk to some of the panelists and have a bit of discussion about it, apart from Dan, sadly, who won't be joining us virtually for drinks. Yeah. So what I would like to do is give each of the panelists just no drinks for you. You can have one there, actually, and we'll just watch. So just like under a minute. Like if you want people here to take away one thing from the discussions we've had today, you have one thing you want to say to stick with people. Now is your chance to say it. It's a bit like the political debates. This is the moment to convince the people of your argument. Dan, from far away, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay.
Sure. I guess my minute would be, 1, change is possible. It happens all the time, even in contexts where we think things can't change. They do over time and across agency. 2, we can learn about that chain by thinking about variation within our projects across agencies, over time, etc. And that 3, we really need to think harder about not kind of, this sort of buzzwordy big think of development, but of what it takes to make an individual project work and be sort of razor focused on what it takes to make a project successful and what it takes to enable those things. And that's going to be different by the project and by the thing, but often it's going to involve thinking more about the error of too much control and what we need to do to reduce controls to get greater results and more accountability on the ground.
Thanks, Dan. Nalima.
Yeah, I guess the main takeaway for me would be that structure is not really, no panacea to the problems that development agencies face. And that the title of this session, I think, was Development Agency from Reform to Renewal, right? So essentially I would distinguish those two. Reform is not the same as renewal. Changing organograms, for example, can become little more than technocratic fiddling if it's not accompanied by new political configurations to support the change and really make it work. So real renewal, I think, requires a lot more political courage. It requires cultivating really new mentalities, new narratives, and new political sources of support. And really we should think about cultivating those first before embarking on costly reform processes. And those reform processes, or those renewal processes, should be anchored really in the reality of working on the front line, I would say, as opposed to headquarters.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Val, over to you.
Well, thank you to my panellists, first of all, because I think it was a really rich discussion. I guess main message for me, or main takeaways, firstly, it's right that we in DFID ask ourselves a lot of the challenge that we're getting, and I think we are asking ourselves those questions, and we are on this kind of journey of renewal in a lot of the areas we've talked about, whether that's the cross-government space, the results, even our kind of empowered accountability model. So those are all kind of journeys of change we are on. One thing I've learned doing this role for a year is change is not fast in a 3,000 strong bureaucracy, but there is a will to change those things, and I'm very keen for us to keep having this challenge, really.
Thanks, Val. Pablo.
Well, DFID is worth saving, I would say. I was in Madrid recently, and people in Spain, the most enlightened practitioners in development, look to the UK with envy, and that happens in many other countries. But then that means that those of us who are not in DFID should stop talking to DFID and should start talking about DFID to the rest of the country. I think those of us who are part of the aid ecosystem need to start assuming some responsibility for our future instead of merely delegating it to those who are public servants.
Thanks, Pablo. That's really helpful. I mean, it's been really fascinating for me during this event just to hear how often so many of the terms that get criticised, results and value for money, even the question of mergers and everything else, actually, for most people, it's just the function they perform anyway, right? So we can criticise the terms, but very few want to argue with the basic premise that we have to deliver results and that value for money is important and that actually structure is not as important as what you do with it. So there's a kind of bit of a task, I think, to move it beyond that based on discussions like this into kind of what do these change processes actually look like, an alternative vision for results, an alternative vision for value for money, for example. So we're all finished now. So I want to thank the panelists in particular for their excellent contributions and for all of you for your questions and coming, and the people online. I hope I got through enough questions. There's a drinks reception, so you can come and grill the panelists or have a further debate. And please join me now in thanking them for coming along and contributions.